Hey guys, and welcome back to another video. Recently I've been playing a bunch on my Shaman ult and I was like, let's make a guide on it. Anyway, this guide will give you all you need to push your keystone achieve, curve, and mythic raid kills. I'll be mentioning top legendary, talents, covenants, tips I learned while playing the spec myself, soulbinds, and conduits for both M+ and raiding. But before we start, please sub, like, and hit that bell button if you enjoy the vid, as it really helps the channel grow. Anyway, without further ado, let's go straight into it. Hope you enjoy.
The shadows will take you.
Alright, first as always, let's talk talents. Starting with the first row. This row honestly starts quite strong for shamans. All three talents seeing some use in at least one type of content. Let's start with Torrent. Torrent tends to be the number one pick for raiding. It increases the initial healing of a Riptide by 20%. Considering that Riptide is the spell you will be using to keep the group up, the increase on the initial healing of Riptide makes the job easier, and overall provides more sustainable healing for the raid group. Undulation. Undulation is more of the dungeon pick, as it can quite honestly take your tank from 10% to full health with mastery in mind, of course. However, in raiding, it tends to not be the pick as the value is single target only. Next up, Unleash Life. Quite a fun option, and although the other two tend to be picked over Unleash, it's a very valid choice for raiding in dungeons. I recommend you guys try it out. It's an instant cast and can do both single target or AoE healing, as the effect it gives to one of your spells can either be on an AoE healing spell or on a single target. Up next, second row. To be quite frank with you, at the moment the only viable option is Echo of the Elements. The extra Riptide is huge for our overall healing, both in raiding and dungeoning. And the extra Lava Burst is great for when we're not healing and we want to do some damage, making our damage output and our healing output much better, making this talent the best pick. The other two don't see play as Riptide plays such a huge part in our healing. Next, third row. More of a utility row, and just like in my other guides, with this type of talent tree choice, use what you choose. Generally speaking, when it comes to raiding, Spirit Wealth is the go-to. However, in dungeons, that's where things can be changed around a bit. Earthgrab being a great tool to root a pack to let your tank kite away, or perhaps prevent some mobs' abilities. I'm thinking of the assassins inside of Plagueful, for example, when they're summoned, the little spiders are summoned by the assassin. Static Charge being more of a filler for when you won't be seeing any use for your Ghost Wolf, or you won't be needing the grab. Fourth row. Just like the first row, it's quite flexible. Earthen Wall Totem usually being the play for raiding, but also a great pick for dungeons, as the shielding it awards for Pride is quite the addition, though Shaman does not like AoE healing. Ancestral Vigor tends to be a great pick for dungeons, the 10% increase in health making hard-hitting abilities less deadly and more preventable. Last choice being Ancestral Protection Totem, which is more of a niche pick and sees some use in some mechanics in raiding, possibly some planned out mechanic in dungeons, though the CD is pretty long, making the other two sustainable choices compared to this one. Quite honestly, the other two options are less situational and see much more play. Fifth row is another utility-based row, with some interesting choices. Firstly, Nature's Guardian, a passive ability that heals you for 20% of your HP when you get below 35% health on a 45 seconds cooldown. A good option to survive mechanics in dungeons and hard-hitting abilities, though in raid it lags compared to Graceful Spirit, which once again is more a niche pick with high utility, making you able to use Ancestral Guidance more often, as well as a small speed buff while using it. Lastly but not least, Windrush Totem, an iconic ability when it comes to raiding and to skip mechanics. A bit like on Artificial Xemox this tier while running away from the sword, it completely nullifies the mechanic. Sixth row. Generally speaking, Flash, Flood, and Downpour are useless in PvE. Flash Flood seeing a lot of play in PvP, but when it comes to PvE, Cloudburst Totem just rules. In both raiding and M+, it just rules. The burst healing it gives is sometimes a game changer, especially on things like Pride or just overall raid healing. Last row, starting with the talent High Tide. This talent sees close to no play as Chain Heal is not an ability we tend to use this patch, making this talent pretty useless in general. Wellspring being more of the raiding choice here, the extra raid-wide healing is just nice and overall the better option, leaving us with Ascendance for M+. Ascendance being a great 3-minute cooldown that will make tough spots much easier to handle in M+, and overall in dungeons. Here are the talents I would recommend when trying to get your plus 15 achieve. This build gives you great sustainable healing and an extra cooldown with Earthen Wall Totem to make surviving Pride much easier. When it comes to raiding, both in HC and Mythic, this is what most players tend to play with. Sometimes possibly changing Windrush Totem for something else when the group does not need it, or if the comp has multiple Shamans, or possibly you have enough Druids to not really care about it anymore. Now with a decent idea of what talents you should play, let's have a look at what covenants you should join. I'll make a small mention on each, but honestly there are only two viable options at the moment. Let's start out with Necrolord, the overall most popular option for Resto Shamans. What's good about Necrolord ability, you might be wondering? So the reason why Primordial Wave is so strong healing wise is because it plays perfectly into a legendary and into a stronger spell being Riptide. Primordial Wave will either apply Flame Shock if used on an enemy, or it will apply Riptide if used on an ally, so an extra hot or a dot on an enemy. This effect is somewhat underwhelming at first glance, but when paired with the next effect this spell does, you realize why it's quite insane. Your next healing wave will heal every single one affected by Riptide for 60% of its original heal. This, if used around your Marsh tree, will quite honestly heal those people by 50% of their health, hence why it's an insane ability, especially when it comes to raiding, but also quite noticeable as well in dungeons. The signature ability Fleshcraft gives us an extra shield, which surprisingly works pretty well with Shaman, as we already have decent mobility with Ghostwolf. Necrolords is the overall best choice for raiding, and it's on an equal footing with Venthyr when it comes to dungeons. Speaking of Venthyr, it's our next covenant to talk about. Venthyr tends to be the second most popular choice, as it gives us a pretty offensive spell being Chain Harvest, dealing insane amounts of damage, but also healing allies by an important number too, making this ability quite desirable in dungeons, as the extra damage is always welcomed in timed content. It's slightly below Necrolords when it comes to raiding, mostly because it will only affect up to 5 allies, making it less viable than Primordial Wave. The signature ability, Doors of Shadow, is a welcome teleport. Although the impact of this spell is pretty minor, it can be great to reposition during boss fights and such, making it a fair addition to the Shaman toolkit. With the two competitive Covenant choices out of the way, let's have a look at Kyrian and its ability Vesper Totem. Now, generally speaking, this ability could have a lot of potential. The main problem with this ability is the range that the totem needs to be to have the desired effects, which is 8 yards, which honestly makes this ability restricted and tough to use, although you can change where the totem is, wasting a global on it and also having to move yourself to make it worth it is a bit of a waste. But from my point of view, I would suggest keeping an eye on Kyrian as a Resto Shaman, as it could have a lot of potential in the future. The signature ability though lacks compared to all the other covenants. The removal of a negative effect is always nice, but does not bring as much as Fleshcraft, for example, or the other abilities out there. Last but not least, Night Fae. Now, Night Fae for Resto Shaman has a pretty interesting spell, Fate Transfusion. Although right now this ability lacks in both damage and healing, if we compare it to Venthyr, it's not impossible that in a later patch it comes above Chain Harvest. That being said, the main weakness to this ability is that you need 4 targets to get the maximum value out of this ability, in both healing and damaging, unlike all the other covenants. That also being said, Soul Shape remains a very strong and desirable mobility cooldown when it comes to signature abilities. Alright, now having joined the Covenant, let's talk conduits. When it comes to potency conduits, generally speaking, you'll want one potency conduit dedicated to your Covenant ability upgrade, and the other potency conduit to be swirling currents, as it also gives your Cloudburst totem even more value by making your next 3 healing surges, Healing Wave, or Riptides do more healing, making it a great choice of potency conduit. Next up, let's talk Finesse Conduit. Now generally, you will want to use Thunderous Pulse for raiding, for the extra 10% speed while in Ghost form. For dungeons, you'll want to use Totemic Surge as it reduces the CD of all your utility totems, such as Tremor Totem. Last but not least, Endurance Conduit. For this, I would recommend Refreshing Waters, as it makes healing yourself much faster and efficient. Healing Surge basically topping you, making self-healing less of a chore. Last mention for Borrowed Power, that being your legendary, a core item that generally speaking will make you much stronger. For Restoration Shamans, I'm afraid the choices are lacking, and usually you will use the same legendary for every type of PvE content. The legendary I'm referring to is Primal Tidecore. The reason for this legendary to be this strong is mostly because of how strong Riptide is right now. But if you are a Necrolord, this is where things get a bit OP. This legendary takes into account Primal Wave, and therefore gets a bonus if you're playing Necrolord. But even if you aren't, this legendary is just the best option for consistency, which is what we're looking for in the current patch. Having said that, let's talk mastery. Now, generally speaking, Restore Shaman Mastery Deep Healing is quite easy to understand. You heal more based on the target's health. The lower the health, the more bonus healing you get, depending on your mastery. Which, quite honestly, having played with it for a while now, is not hard to play around compared to some other specs out there. With that in mind, I'll also mention 2 passives that as a Restore Shaman you want to keep in mind while playing. The first of which is Tidal Waves, a passive that grants you a stack of itself every time you press Riptide on any given target. Its effects are to decrease the cast time of your next healing wave by 20% or to increase your crit chance when using Healing Surge by 40%. This mechanic is a core element of the spec and you want to play around it. Always try to have this active while casting. Generally speaking, you will have 2 stacks, but in tougher situations you may find yourself overwhelmed and just completely forget about it, so try to keep that in mind. Last note that I want to bring up before wrapping the video is Resurgent, your second passive. What it does is refund mana while critting, and quite honestly also makes Restore Shamans durable when it comes to mana. Healing Wave rewarding more mana when critting, so using Healing Wave in general is the better option as opposed to Healing Surge, as it just eats at your mana. Anyway, I think I've gone long enough. Hope you enjoyed the vid, and as every time, have a nice one and see you around, guys.
The shadows will take you.